And say go. How's it going, guys? I'm Cody.
And this is Eli, and you are watching/listening to the Commander Cafe.
Today we're going to take a look at our very first deck tech, and we're going to be going over Eli's build of Tasigur the Golden Fang.
So Tasigur is a legendary creature that is 6 cost, 5 is colorless and 1 is black. He has Delve to reduce the casting cost by 1 colorless for each card you exile from your graveyard while casting. And he can, for 2 colorless and then 2 hybrid green or blue, put the top 2 cards of your library into the graveyard and return a non-land card of an opponent's choice from your graveyard to your hand for a 4/5. Overall, the goal of the deck is to ramp up some powerful X spells, and until then keep an overall advantage versus the other players. Due to my general playstyle, there's a sub-theme of mill that can be traded out by removing only a few cards, which I will list off at the end.
Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with some stats here. You run with 18 creatures, 8 instants, 11 sorceries, 17 enchantments, 6 artifacts, and 38 lands.
There's 5 board wipes, 10 single target removal spells, 10 ramp spells, 10 draw spells, and about 14 recursion spells.
So that the single removal is a bit higher than we would normally run. If you guys don't know, we generally stick to Command Zone's template where they have 5 board wipes, 5 single removal, 10 ramp, 10 draw. And if you guys haven't seen that video, we'll leave a link for that down in the description below. So why do you have 10 removal in the deck?
Well, a lot of it kind of varies. There's a lot of board removal, but I have things like Scavenging Ooze to help remove things from opponents' graveyards that might come back. I have a handful of counter spells, which I wasn't completely counting as a full removal, or a couple things pretty much like just I wouldn't count them as full removal spells, and so I kind of raised the number, and a lot of them were dual purpose.
Okay, so dual purpose, kind of a Sultai control shell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the overall deck comes out on Card Kingdom to $260.13. One of the expensive cards of the deck is Scarab God, which I personally don't think you have to run, so that can drop the price by $50 right there.
Stupid standard raising the prices of our commander cards.
Okay, so listing off some of the important cards in each group. Starting off with removal, which I combined both board wipes and single target in this. The majority was what I had on hand, so you can pretty much replace a lot of the cards with what you have on hand for board wipes or single target. Some of the cards I'd recommend keeping. Commit to Memory.
So commit, the first half of it is commit 4 mana, 3 and 1 blue. It's an instant speed, put target spell or non-land permanent into its owner's library, second from the top. So you're able to counter something with this or take care of a problematic permanent on the field, at least for a couple turns, unless you have a way to make them shuffle, or mill, which this deck does have a few ways to do. And the other half is memory that I'm having to turn my head to read. It is 4 and 2 blue, so 6 mana total for a sorcery. Aftermath, which means you cast it from your graveyard. Each player shuffle his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library, then draws 7 cards.
So overall, this card is, while it's in there for the removal, it's also there for the recursion, because with Tasigur's ability and a handful of the other cards in this deck, you'll be sending a lot of your own cards to the grave, and so you want to be able to, if you send a few too many, just bring your entire deck back. This does cancel out any milling, so I did have it for that in case I didn't want to actually win with milling with this deck.
And you could also just mill this into your graveyard and then cast the second half without casting the first half is another option to go there.
Mm-hmm. So it has a lot of value for being in this deck. The next card is one of the board wipes. However, I also use this as a payoff for late game to try and win, is Torment of Hail. Because overall you're going to get a lot of cards out of their hand, off their board, and probably take some life. And it can also be used relatively early in the game because you can recur it later on to help get rid of some of their early game stuff that might take out their commander even for their first casting.
In case you guys don't know, Torment of Hailfire is an X cost and then 2 black. For a sorcery, repeat the following process X times. Each opponent loses 3 life unless that player sacks a non-land permanent or discards a card. And I don't know if I've ever seen you actually cast this without X being around 10 to 13 cards, or 10 to 13 for X.
Yeah, for the most part, if you can hold off for a little while, have some other people handle some of the scarier stuff, you can usually build up a lot of mana and hopefully wait till the control players are tapped out and just play this for a pretty powerful board reset that saves your stuff pretty well.
And I'd say that's one of the more important things with this deck is knowing when to cast your spells and when to try and get your opponents to take care of the problematic stuff on the board for you.
Yeah, one of the big things with this whole deck is because Tasigur's ability is letting your opponent decide what to bring. If you can, try and make friends with someone at the table. That's going to be the person you're also going to try and talk into removing stuff from the field. So next up we have a fun board wipe, Decree of Pain, that it's not just a board wipe, but it fills your hand with cards, and I want to pretty much include this in every one of my black decks.
Yeah, Decree of Pain is 6 mana, or 8 mana total, 6 generic, 2 black. For a sorcery, destroy all creatures. They can't be regenerated. Draw a card for each creature destroyed this way. It also has cycling for 3 and 2 black, so 5 mana total. You can discard this card, draw a card, but when you cycle it, Decree of Pain, all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. Normally not cycling it away unless you absolutely have to early on in the game. But really, this is, I feel like, a really underrated card. It's one of my favorites as well, just because it doubles as a board wipe and card draw at the same time.
Definitely. It's one of the... I don't understand how it's only, I think, 20 or 30 cents, maybe $1. Yeah. So next up we have Beast Within. It's just amazing to have in any deck that can use green mana because you get to destroy target permanent at instant speed. And so when that threat is coming towards you, go ahead and remove it with this.
And Beast Within is 2 generic, 1 green, so 3 mana total. For an instant destroy target permanent, its controller puts a 3/3 green beast creature token onto the battlefield. So good removal, instant speed. Doesn't get everything if it's indestructible, but the important thing is it takes care of any permanent. So not just creatures, it can hit lands, enchantments, planeswalkers, whole range of things with this card.
Any card that doesn't have indestructible or hexproof, basically.
And our next category is Ramp. And
overall, since this deck likes to use a lot of mana for things, it needs some ways to get the mana out there. It uses a whole lot of basic lands in this deck. I found mainly because of Perilous Forays, which is one of the key ramp enchantments that I have because I can sacrifice creatures to it anytime they would get destroyed by a board wipe, and every creature gives me extra lands.
Yeah, this is a card I hadn't seen until you played it in this deck, but I really like it. I may have to put it into a few of my green decks. Perilous Forays is a 5 mana, 3 generic, 2 green for an enchantment, and it has tap 1 mana, sack a creature, search your library for a land card with a basic land type, and put it into play tapped, then shuffle your library. Sack effects in general are good. As he said, even if a board wipe comes, someone targets one of your creatures to try and get rid of it. If they try and exile it, you can sack it so it goes to the graveyard so that you can recur it, especially in this deck, and still get value out of it as long as you have that 1 mana to pay.
Mm-hmm. So next up was one that I actually found in the common box at our local card store, is Overgrowth. Because overall it's just a relatively cheap enchantment that gives me 2 extra mana value from any of my lands. And even though it's green mana, I have well over enough stuff in this deck that can use green that it's probably one of my favorite enchantments.
Yeah. And even if you aren't using it for the green, you have enough X spells in the deck that you're using it to help pay for those X costs. So just so you guys know, Overgrowth is a 3 mana enchantment, 2 generic and 1 green for enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, it produces an additional 2 mana. So I think this is very unassuming when you first look at it. We're used to seeing a lot of mana rocks in the format, but for 3 mana, this really does a better job in most cases than the mana rocks. It's harder to take care of. Land destruction isn't as big in our format as artifact removal. So I think this does a lot more work than you're going to expect it to.
Especially since, as an enchantment, this deck especially runs enough enchantments that a single target enchantment spell is not going to go after Overgrowth versus a lot of the other stuff that I have sitting around.
Yeah, if you have an enchantment removal, there's going to be more important things usually on the field than to hit this.
So the next one, or next two, are Burgeoning and Exploration. Personally, between the two, I would prefer Burgeoning, as it allows, with all the extra card draw in this deck, I would prefer to be able to play a land on every opponent's turn versus on my own.
So we'll go ahead and we'll read both of those. Burgeoning is a 1 green for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent plays a land, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield, and then Exploration is 1 green mana again for an enchantment. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. So Exploration, like he said, as long as you have the card draw, Burgeoning gets you up to 4 lands per rotation at the table, where Exploration will only get you 2. So as long as you have the card draw to support it, then Burgeoning will be the better option for you.
Mm-hmm. Other than that, the majority of the ramp in the deck came from green ramp spells or a couple others that can relatively easily be swapped out. But on to the next category, we have card draw, which is your favorite category.
It is. I love drawing cards, and I am not happy when other people get to draw more cards than I do.
Well, next up is one of your favorite card draws. It is Rhystic Study.
Rhystic Study. Did you pay the 1? I love this card. Probably like you said, one of my favorite cards overall. Probably next to Consecrated Sphinx, my favorite blue card. But anyway, Rhystic Study is a 3 mana enchantment, 2 generic, 1 blue. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. So it's notorious for each time someone plays a spell, you asking them, did you pay the 1? Do you pay 1 or you let me draw 1? Normally it'll come down to if they have the extra mana. But if they want to play more with their cards or with their hand, a lot of times they'll just let you draw that card. So a lot of games, this can do a lot of work, draw you 10, 15 cards per game. Be interesting to actually keep track of how many cards in a game you actually get to draw off of this. But.
Mm-hmm. So the nice thing about Sultai colors is, in addition to Rhystic Study, I get to run things like Death Reap Ritual and Sylvian Library, which are both practically, I wouldn't say as good as Rhystic Study, but fairly close.
Yeah, Death Reap Ritual is a 4-mana enchantment, 2 and black and green. For enchantment, has Morbid. At the beginning of each instep, if a creature died this turn, you may draw a card. This is a enchantment I think is very underrated. I started running it in a lot of my, actually all my Golgari decks have this in it now, because those colors tend to have a lot of sack outlets, care about creatures dying. So you have ways to trigger it and get value out of it, in addition to just creatures are just going to die naturally throughout the game. I think most turns you actually end up drawing a card off of it, even if you don't try and trigger it.
And then after that is Sylvian Library, which is 1 colorless and 1 green for the enchantment that says, at the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn, and for each of those pay 4 life or put them back on top of your library.
It's a great green card. It is a little pricey, but most green decks are going to be happy with this. It's card selection. Even if you don't pay the 4 life, you're getting to choose those out of your top 3, which card do you want? And that ability is very powerful. And then, of course, early on, when you have the life, you can pay that extra life to get those cards if you need them.
And then an extra kind of more expensive mana cost spell or enchantment that I have laying around in the deck is Thought Refraction, which I try to pair up with Sylvan Library when I can, because then I'm basically drawing 4 cards a turn if I don't want to draw the extra 2 cards.
Yeah. So Thought Reflection is 4 mana, or 4 generic and 3 blue, so 7 mana total for enchantment, where if you would draw a card, you draw 2 cards instead. So the way this works with Sylvan Library is at the beginning of your draw step, you're drawing 6 cards total, because Sylvan Library makes you draw 3, and then you put 2 back. Well, with this, you're drawing 6 cards and putting 2 back still. So you're getting to draw a bunch of extra cards with card selection in there.
Mm-hmm. Following up, we have the final category, which is Recursion. Because of all the self-mill, any board wipes, anything like that, the deck's going to end up with a lot of stuff in the graveyard, so you want to be able to bring them back. So some of the key cards include Shieldred, the Whispering One, Eternal Witness, Skullwinder, and then I use a couple Lilianas. However, a lot of these can be kind of dealer's choice. You don't have to use all of them, but whatever you have on hand or can get a hold of, these are pretty much all. If you can't include them in a black or a green deck, you would probably run them.
Right. And we're not going to run through what all these cards do. We'll have them up on the screen for you guys. Shieldred is probably the scariest one. Does a lot of work because it's also forcing your opponents to sacrifice creatures in addition to you recurring them. So it kind of does double duty, and whenever it hits the board, it's definitely a must answer.
Mm-hmm. Overall, as long as you have a decent amount of recursion, you should be able to keep this deck going on indefinitely. I found some fun combos a little while back with this deck. However, it did involve having to get off the Liliana Defiant Necromancer emblem, which is whenever a creature dies, return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. With all of the sack outlets and creature destruction, it ended up getting me every card that my opponents would play, and I was using that to mill them with Altar of Dementia. So overall, some pretty brutal combos can be found. Scarab God is one of the, like I mentioned before, it's a recursion card, but for this deck, I don't think it's necessary. So you can run it, you don't have to. There's probably plenty of better cards to have in there if you want more consistent, because he'll exile the things as they go.
Yeah, I was going to say, he has to go from the battlefield to the grave, right, in order to get him back to your hand? He has to die.
Yes, so he's not even self-recurring.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you mill him out with Tasigur, then you won't get him back. Strong creature, but not necessary, I would say, for this deck. You have enough recursion in here that...
not really going to run out of recursion.
If you do have him, it is nice to use it on your opponents. Because you do have ways to mill your opponents slightly in this deck. So if you can mill them for a bit and grab one of their creatures.
Also, in addition to, I had mentioned before, Perilous Forays, which was the sack outlet to find some basic lands. Some of the other sack outlets that I run in this deck are Ashnod's Altar, Altar of Dementia, and Evolutionary Leap, which... they're all relatively cheap to play and to use. Ashnod's and Altar of Dimension, but both will be free. Evolutionary Leap, you have to pay a green and sack the creature, but all of them give you some sort of benefit or will hurt your opponents in some way, while also getting your creatures off the board. If someone's trying to take control of them or target them with any spells, just sacrifice them, you'll get them back later.
Yep.
So continuing on, the last mini category of this deck is mill, because I just have this tendency to try and mill people.
Normally by accident, but yeah.
The mill cards in this deck were not originally put in there as I plan on winning by mill. It was, I am using these colors, and I enjoy at least removing some of the cards that opponents might draw into. So there's really three main ones. There's Altar of Dementia, which was the sack outlet I listed before, which that one I'll read off real quick is 2 colorless mana for an artifact that says sacrifice a creature. Target player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power from the top of his library into their graveyard.
And the nice thing about this is because it's instant speed, if someone board wipes, you can, or targets your creature, you can, in response, mill them with that same creature. Very powerful.
I usually use it more as a deterrence from a board wipe than encouraging it, because if they are going to, then I can threaten them of, hey, you should probably reconsider, I will mill you otherwise. Otherwise, if I know the board wipe's coming, I can also just use it on someone who has attacked me or something.
We've had this kind of scenario a couple times in our play group where someone can instant speed mill somebody out, or mill someone for a lot anyway, and it's surprisingly how good it is at a deterrent, because most of the time you're milling them for 30 cards or whatever, and unless you have there's a big threat on the table that needs to be answered, people aren't willing to do that unless they have a lot of recursion in their own deck. So it definitely works as a good deterrent against attacks against you.
But as far as mill goes in this deck, it's just Altar of Dementia, Consuming Apparition, which is definitely a mill deck based card, and Dread Summons, which was one of my X spells, although with green and black, you're not really limited to what X spells you use. You can flavor those as needed. Consuming Apparition was one of the cards that I just needed a large creature due to all of the graveyard based strategies with this deck.
Yeah, so Consuming Apparition is a 5 mana, 3 generic, 1 blue, 1 black for a creature horror, and its power and toughness is star. So its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in each of your opponent's graveyards. Whenever you cast a spell, each opponent reveals the top card of his or her library until he or she reveals a land card, then puts those cards into his or her graveyard. So the nice thing about this one is it mills your opponents on its own, but then in addition to that, it's huge because of that. So if you have this out and Altar of Dementia, it's pretty safe, because if they go to remove it, you can mill them oftentimes for 30, 40, 50 cards.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the, if you have Altar of Dementia out and Consuming Apparition, if anyone attacks you or threatens to remove it, you can mill them for game to wipe them out at least. Or otherwise, you have a creature that the later in the game you are, the larger it's going to get, and for 5 mana you can have something that's 30 or 40 power and toughness, and that's just, there's not many ways to lose from that point.
Yeah, I would say if you have this out with Altar of Dementia, you're kind of in a tough spot, because you have to remove it, but at the same time, it's going to hurt you a lot, possibly kill you if you do remove it. So someone generally has to just bite the bullet and take one for the table if they want to get rid of it. Otherwise, it can really get out of hand quick.
Mm-hmm. And then the other mill card was Dread Summons, which is an X and 2 black mana for a sorcery where each player puts the top X cards of his or her library into their graveyard. For each creature card put into the graveyard this way, you get to put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield tapped. So not only is it going to mill them for whatever you put into X, you're going to have a board full of zombies that you could either use to swing out, you can sack them to Altar of Dementia, you can sack them to Ashnods to get a bunch of extra colorless so that you can play your Torment of Hailfire or your blatant or Villainous Wealth, which is the other, probably one of the core cards of this deck that I try and use to win is Villainous Wealth, which overall is the 3 Sultai colors and X for a sorcery that...
I was wondering how much you could remember off the top of your head without having to look it up.
For X, target opponent will exile his or her library. You can, the top cards of his or her library.
Top X cards, yeah.
You may cast any number of non-land cards with converted mana cost X or less from among them without paying their mana cost. So the one time I've been able to actually play this spell, I got to play about 7 dragons and a few enchantments from the Dragon Player's deck, and was at that point, with all those free, powerful dragons, I was able to pretty much secure my board state in winning the game.
Yeah, I think you had X equals 14 in that instance, and it's just like, well, I'm looking at the top 14 cards of your deck, and I'm playing anything I want.
Yeah.
Very powerful card. I think often overlooked. I think it's in the $1 price range.
Yeah, it's at most $1 or $2. It's not really seeing too much play. However, I do know that a lot of people, when they build Tasigur decks, they are actually more so this Villainous Wealth type decks, which is basically what gave me the idea in the first place, because Tasigur used to be Sidisi Broad Tyrant, and then I realized that he works a little better for the overall theme of this deck.
Yeah, we're already seeing a lot of the synergies with even just within the mill package that you have here, of being able to mill your opponents, take stuff from their graveyards, put stuff into your graveyards, threaten them with the X spells, and then like the Dread Summonings, pumping that full of X, milling them, which is going to make your Apparition bigger if you have him out, and give you an army of zombies in addition to all that. Mm-hmm. So the way these cards work together is, like, I was really impressed when seeing it all come together every time I see it. So,
other than that, the rest of this deck list will be posted on our Tapped Out, which we will have listed below. And if you have any ideas for decks that you want us to try putting together ourselves, and we can see what kind of theme we go with, and just try out different commanders. If you guys have any ideas, just let us know in the comments. If you like anything about this particular deck, feel free to comment as well, and we'll get back to you on maybe alternate ideas you had of inclusions for this deck.
Make sure you hit that subscribe button and that like button. It really helps out a lot. Also, follow us on Twitter. It's at Commander Cafe. And other than that, we will see you guys next time.
Have a good one.